James, thank you so much for joining us on the Hurt Teen podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you spent many years speaking and writing about ADHD and adulthood. What is the one thing you wish more people understood about what ADHD actually is?
That's such a good question. Probably that it's more complicated than most people think. If you look at the community of people with ADHD who are neurodivergent, we are neurodiverse as a neurodivergent group. So you won't really find two people with ADHD who were exactly the same. And I think that's difficult to explain to people that don't understand ADHD, that assume that our symptoms and behaviours and traits will all be very similar, where they're not. And this is one of the reasons that some people talk about ADHD as a strength or a superpower, and for other people it feels like a disability or a challenge. And that's because we all have these different brains, different experiences, and it's a really complicated condition that's often far too simplified into kind of memes and TikTok videos that say if you do these 5 things you've got ADHD, and often actually that's not true.
What would you say are the most damaging or the most misconceived ideas around ADHD?
How long have you got? So there's lots of really persistent myths. The way I like to phrase this, I'm old enough, 50 this year, to remember when chronic fatigue syndrome was called yuppie flu. Kind of back in the late 80s, 90s, nobody believed it was real, and the press would talk about how it was young people trying to get out of work, and that's pretty much where we are with ADHD now, that many people don't think it's real. So that's the first myth. And yet we know, from thousands of scientific studies imaging the brain, looking at behaviours, it's real. Another myth that's really damaging is that it's kind of trendy and new. And if you look, actually, the first medical text on ADHD was published in 1775 in Germany, and it was called Attention Deficit. The first British medical text published in 1902, when ADHD was called an abnormal defect of moral control in children. So that may be where some of the stigma started, I imagine, around ADHD. The reason people think it's new is it wasn't on our radar. You couldn't even be diagnosed with it as an adult on the NHS till 2008. It wasn't a diagnostic pathway, so it's real, it's impactful. And probably the last one, just in the interest of time, is, and this is really damaging, is women have it too. And this is one of the big issues we have with ADHD, is the test for ADHD was designed in boys. It was a bunch of psychiatrists looking at boys, mostly white boys with ADHD, and trying to work out how do we design a test to pick up what those boys have. And boys and girls, men and women, present slightly differently. And that means for many years it's just not really been considered that women or girls have ADHD, because they don't look like that typical hyperactive boy running around and being behaviourally challenging.
And as far as I'm aware, women do tend to feel like more of an imposter. They tend to not have that hyperactivity side as much, and they tend to sort of play it through more in their head. It's sort of
it's interesting, because even if you look at the diagnostic criteria for hyperactivity, it's split between hyperactivity and impulsiveness. So it's not even 9 symptoms of hyperactivity, it's a mixture of hyperactivity and if you're impulsive. And then the hyperactivity itself is split into the external hyperactivity, fidgeting, which I do all the time, and the internal hyperactivity, which is restlessness, feeling like you're driven by a motor. And those internalized symptoms are more common in girls and women. And equally, the way in which ADHD presents in girls and women is different. So boys are more likely, but not always, to be hyperactive and very ebullient and hustle and bustle around. Girls are more likely to be more introspective, more daydreamy, more internalized. And then as we grow up into adults, again, those symptoms are slightly different between men and women. And that's partly, again, because the test isn't very good at picking up ADHD in women, because it's looking for the wrong symptoms at times.
And are there suicide rates higher in women generally?
Yeah, in both men and women. So on average, the ADHD community is 5 times more likely to make a suicide attempt. With women and men, it's more difficult to work out the difference between the two, because the studies aren't very good on this. They're often either very large population studies, and remember that 90% of people with ADHD are undiagnosed, And therefore, if studies are looking at people with a diagnosis, they're missing out all of the people that don't have one. So as a group, we do have a higher risk of suicide.
Will you take us back to your own diagnosis and what led you to that moment, and what were you experiencing at that time?
So I was diagnosed February 2021, but I knew 6 years before that I had ADHD. My co-author of ADHD Unpacked and co-host of the podcast, Alex Connor, he was diagnosed in 2015, and he phoned me up and said, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and you're way more ADHD than I am. And we kind of laughed and joked, and I went online and did the tests, and it looked like I did have ADHD. And I just did nothing with the information, largely because at the time, and this is a massive cognitive dissonance, I hated myself, loathed myself with the burning intensity of 1,000 suns, but I was worried if I took medication it would change me. And therefore my worry was, well, what's the point of getting a diagnosis? Because if I take medication, it's just going to take away some part of my personality, which I didn't like anyway. So I waited, and I even helped a colleague get diagnosed before me where I worked. And this is for a lot of people with ADHD, this will resonate. Second lockdown of the pandemic in the winter, it's dark. I was an academic having to spend every day sat in a tiny little office talking to a computer, nobody talking back. And after 12 weeks of that, I went into a mental health crisis. And that's when I realised I need to get help with this, at the same time as knowing I was probably bipolar. So I went for a private diagnosis in February 2021 and kind of embraced it immediately because I'd had that lead-in time of knowing that I probably had it.
So what was your journey then following the diagnosis?
It was, let's do something about this. For a lot of people, diagnosis is challenging because particularly for a late diagnosed adult with ADHD, we can feel like we tricked the psychiatrist, or maybe we don't have ADHD and we're just all the internal labels we've given ourselves for years. But I think because I'd had that lead in time, I just immediately thought, right, what can I do with this? How can I help other people? Because if you get a diagnosis, which is challenging enough, and then get access to medication, that's pretty much it. Off you go out into the world and try and understand yourself and explain ADHD to your partner, your family, your friends, your employers. And there really wasn't much there. So immediately, Alex and I set up a podcast, and we then set up a charity for adults with ADHD, and then started writing and trying to create content so people could see evidence-based information about ADHD, because most of the stuff out there on social media is lived experience or memes, which often kind of aren't true. So we thought, let's get some good evidence-based information about what ADHD is out there. So straight away we were into, let's use this now as a vehicle to help people.
And that's what's so great about your podcast and your book, is that you do a really deep dive into actually what ADHD is and all the different ways it can present itself. Because as you said, I think that we are living in this age of overdiagnosis, particularly of ADHD, and actually starting to dispel some of the myths around it, as well as, you know, what is ADHD, and as we discussed earlier, what is actually just normal human brain activity that goes on in everyone.
Yeah, it's such a controversial and difficult topic, and we felt that it was important to help people make the right decision when it comes to either seeking an assessment or, if they've got a diagnosis, understanding themselves better. Because you're right, we chatted before we started recording about how people will often say, I'm a bit ADHD, or well, everyone's a bit ADHD. And that's true, in that the traits of ADHD exist throughout the whole of society and probably always have. Everyone's a little bit impulsive, a little bit forgetful, occasionally interrupts people. But with people that have ADHD, it's having those symptoms more often, to the point where they have a damaging effects on relationships, on finances, on work, on education. And giving people an understanding of why that is can be really powerful in terms of shedding some of the internal negative dialogue, the burden that we carry of thinking that we're unreliable or, you know, lazy, which are the words we often use to describe ourselves. But embracing that identity, that I have ADHD, that's the reason that certain things have happened, is such a powerful tool when it comes to kind of moving forward successfully in life. You
said before that your diagnosis really changed the way that you understood yourself. So in what ways did it reshape how you think now about your past and how you live day to day now?
It had a massive impact, particularly about the past. It allowed me to look at my life through a new lens, to look at the relationships that failed, to look at the jobs that I left after a month because somebody criticised me, and rejection's a big emotional aspect of ADHD, and particularly to try and reappraise a lot of that internal labelling that I had. I'd established very strongly that I'm unreliable, that I'm lazy, there are some things that I just can't do. Why am I not as good as everybody else? Why do I struggle in exams when everyone else seems to do well? And I just thought, they're all flaws in me as a person. Now, being able to look back and say, okay, well, there's a reason that you had challenges in those areas, was really powerful. It took some therapy as well. I had some therapy from an internal family systems therapist, and that was really powerful in me being able to kind of speak to the 13-year-old me that just felt alone and different and misunderstood, and that then helped me to accept myself more.
Mm. So for many adults in the UK, the NHS waiting time for an ADHD diagnosis can be up to 7 years. What would you say to someone who's listening who strongly suspects that they have ADHD but can't access the private route?
Yeah, it's horrifying to think that you get to a point in life where you might realise the reason that you are the way you are, the reason that things have happened, and then think, okay, I'll go for help, and then find out you might have to wait 7 years to even find out if you have ADHD. So if anyone's listening and they're at that point in their journey, the first thing I'd say is go online and do a test called the ASRS, the Adult ADHD Self-Reporting Scale, and that's about 90% accurate at picking up if you have sufficient symptoms of ADHD. Then it starts to get a bit complicated. The NHS waiting times, yeah, they're huge in some areas, and in some areas of the UK there are no services for getting an assessment. There's a slight difference in England. So if somebody is registered at a GP practice in England, they have the right to choose where to be assessed. It's a right that's in the NHS constitution. And there are a series of qualified providers that have NHS contracts that have 6 months, 12 months waiting lists. So if you're at the point, anyone that's listening, of I'd like to look into this further, do that test, go and see your GP, ask to be referred by right to choose to one of the qualified providers. There's details on various websites, including our charity ADHD Adult UK's website. And while you're on the waiting list, you can think about whether it is something you want to pursue, but it's better to be on the list thinking about it than not on the list and waiting to start that journey.
Interjecting real quick, Pandora, after asking the questions, if you could set the paper down.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Awesome.
Got it. You've also spoken quite a lot about medication and ADHD and how that really helped you. Do you still take it now? And what's been your experience taking the medication? Did you have to change it to start with? Was it a bit of trial and error to get the dose right? And how does it generally make you feel?
So in that lead-in period, I'd done all of the research that I needed to do to know exactly which medication I wanted. So when I got the diagnosis and we started the process of what's called titration, where you pick one medication and you increase the dose and measure the impact and the side effects and then keep increasing it until you get to a point that it worked. I take a medication called lisdexamfetamine. It's a slow-release version of amphetamine. And this is why I just had a sip of water, because it dries my mouth out. And when I first took it, I didn't know what to expect, because many people either think it's going to be a diamond bullet to the brain and everything will be easy. And in reality, it just makes you a bit more functional, a bit more able to engage in unrewarding tasks, a bit more able to focus. So the first couple of doses didn't touch the sides. I didn't feel any different. And then when I got to the third dose, I thought, I'm a bit more motivated to do work, and my mood's improved. And then as I got up to the top dose, it just allowed me to do some of the things that were more challenging a little bit easier. Now I've been on the medication for 4 years. It's interesting because there are days where I don't take it and I don't notice the difference. But one of the challenges of ADHD is we often have poorer metacognition, which is thinking about our thoughts and our behaviours. So it's often useful to get somebody else to check whether or not if you're off your meds you are different, because I can feel like, well, there's no difference at all. I'm completely normal. And my wife will say, yeah, no, you're very, very ADHD today. So it is something that I take every day. I may have to take it every day for the rest of my life. Or at some point I might eventually stop if I get to a point where I don't feel I need that extra kind of ability to engage in particularly unrewarding work tasks.
Would you mind just delving a bit sort of into medication in a bit more detail? Because I think, certainly from what I've learned, there are uppers and downers in a sense to regulate people's ADHD. What is the difference and what tend to be the main medications?
Yeah, so there are stimulants and non-stimulants. There's only 4 medications which are licensed for adults, and 3 of them are stimulants. The oldest is called methylphenidate, or Ritalin. Many people may have heard of that. And then there's the 2 forms of amphetamine, quick release and slow release. The other medication is a non-stimulant. That's called atomoxetine, and that's a repurposed antidepressant. And those medications collectively are effective in 80% of people. And all they do is increase the levels of brain chemicals or neurotransmitters that don't work as effectively in ADHD. So dopamine is the best known one, but other brain chemicals like noradrenaline and even serotonin are increased when these medications are taken, and that then changes the way in which the brain functions.
And how about SSRIs? Where do they fit in the mix?
It's a really good question because they can be used, but in the UK they have to be used off license. So medications like Wellbutrin, which is used to help people stop smoking, other medications such as modafinil, some of the newer medications can be prescribed if the licensed meds don't work or the side effects are too great. But that has to be done off license.
Meaning what, sorry?
So what that means is that the NHS won't prescribe it for ADHD unless a psychiatrist makes the decision that I am willing to take the risk of prescribing this medication that isn't licensed for this purpose. And that doesn't happen all that often. But the reason that's important is the other 20%. So the 20% of people for whom the licensed medications either don't work, or there's too many side effects, or they have a health condition that means they can't take the medication, all that 20% get is CBT therapy. And the NHS's own evidence body, NICE, says the evidence for the effectiveness of CBT is low to very low. So if medication can't work for you, there's not a lot out there. So finding other medications and other support systems is really important for those people that either can't get hold of meds because we've been in a medication shortage now for 18 months with ADHD meds, or for whom they just don't work.
Well, it's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, if you're reliant on a drug and then suddenly there's a shortage of it, it's catastrophic. I mean, what are your views on medication? Do you think everyone with a certain level of ADHD needs to be on medication, or do you think you can treat it without the medication?
It's a personal choice, and I think that's really important. And I went on that journey from medication hesitant to embracing medication. It's not for everyone. For some people, the side effects can outweigh the benefits. A big issue with ADHD that most people don't know about, for example, is sleep. So around 2/3 of people with ADHD have a sleep disorder. And obviously taking an amphetamine means that your sleep may be further disrupted. So for some people, it can help them in the day, but then they're not sleeping until 4 or 5 in the morning, and then they're getting up very tired. So for many people, it is a personal choice, and particularly if you've got a child with ADHD and you're at that point of decision making when it's shall we medicate our child, which is a very difficult decision to make. Now, all the evidence shows that children with ADHD who are medicated have better outcomes educationally, financially, in terms of employment. And the only kind of consistent and significant negative is a slight reduction in stature if children are medicated. But it is, like I say, a personal choice. For people that decide not to be medicated, there are things that can help. Exercise helps. We know that. Mindfulness and assisted relaxation can help. But there's not much else that has kind of a strong evidence base. And that's important because particularly on social media, you'll see lots of supplements and products and apps which are being marketed now to people who are desperate for help, saying this is a supplement that will boost your brain function, with literally no evidence that it will. I don't want to say lion's mane, but lion's mane. There's no evidence. It might work. There's just an absence of evidence. Now, if when they do clinical trials and they find that it doesn't work, there's a lot of people that have spent a lot of money buying a supplement that doesn't do anything. But if you're desperate, what are people going to do?
I know, it's such a tricky one. You've spoken a lot about your comorbidity of bipolar and ADHD, and how common is it for people struggling with ADHD to have a comorbidity, which is another mental health issue alongside the ADHD? And then I'd love for you to tell us about how the two interact in your life.
It's far more common than you would even imagine. So probably 80 to 85% of people with ADHD have a coexisting condition. Now, most commonly, that's another neurodivergence. So autism spectrum conditions, dyslexia, dyspraxia, which is now called developmental coordination disorder, they're very common in people who are ADHD. Then there are the mental health coexisting conditions, mood disorders such as bipolar, which I have, anxiety disorders such as social anxiety disorder, which I have, eating disorders, I also have binge eating disorder, issues with substance use and addiction. I was a heavy substance user for 30 years because I was self-medicating. And then you get into the really odd stuff, the physical comorbidities, hyperflexible joints, migraine, chronic migraines, hypothyroidism, gastrointestinal issues, issues with the immune system. So probably the vast majority of people with ADHD have something else that comes with it. Now, for me, amongst that collection of labels and diagnoses, it just makes it more challenging, because the day-to-day management of ADHD is really second to second, minute to minute. I can be full of beans and energy and great 1 minute, and then massively anxious and can't do anything 15 minutes later. With my bipolar, it tends to be over longer time periods, so I can have, a couple of months where I feel pretty stable, and then all of a sudden I have 10 days of very deep depression and all the ideation and dark thoughts and intrusive and thoughts of you're useless, you're a burden, you're just making everything worse for people. And then every so often, once or twice a year, a hypomanic episode where at first it's seductive because I feel like this is ace, I feel great. I want, my test for if I'm hypomanic is, am I on LinkedIn? If I'm on LinkedIn, I'm hypomanic because I hate that platform, but I'm desperate to speak to people. But then it goes beyond that, not sleeping for 4 nights and other issues. So it's just more complicated. Trying to manage the day-to-day, the long-term, the situations you have to sometimes engage with, such as a wedding or a Christmas party, when you've got social anxiety disorder, is really challenging. So the collection of those different mental health and physical health and neurodivergences that I've got just mean it's more difficult day to day.
So there are 2 points that I really like to focus on. I think the hypomania induced by the bipolar versus the hypomania or the manicness induced by the ADHD, and how do you differentiate between the two?
It's difficult, and this is why there are a lot of misdiagnoses. So when I first chatted to my bipolar psychiatrist, because I went for the diagnoses at the same time, but it took me a year on the NHS to get my assessment, the psychiatrist was asking about the day-to-day ups and downs. And I can tell within the space of a day if I am feeling a bit more energetic and a bit brighter and more able to do stuff and engage with people. It's a very different feeling from the hypomania of bipolar. But first, I often don't know I'm hypomanic with bipolar. So the last episode I had, which was about a month ago, in the end, my wife asked me after 2 days, she said, "Are you hypomanic?" And I said, "Why'd you ask?" She said, "Oh, because you're in a good mood." And again, we kind of laughed, and I thought, yeah, I haven't slept for 2 nights. And while I was thinking that, I was dancing in front of her, doing kind of a Ricky Gervais from The Office dance. And I thought, yeah, you're definitely hypomanic. And luckily, I had an appointment with my psychiatrist a few days after that, and the hypomanic episode had gone away, but just talking about it brought it back. And in her office, I was then doing the same Ricky Gervais dance. And she said, I was going to discharge you after this meeting, but I think maybe we'll keep you under my care and I'll speak to my boss and we'll have a chat. So it's, in terms of the magnitude of that hypomania and also the duration, it's kind of different from the 15 to 30 minutes of more brightness and more energy with ADHD.
And how do you manage a hypomanic episode?
It's a good question. For years I didn't. For years that would make me lean into drugs, into partying more, because at first you do feel just, more energized and more desperate for contact and for things to do. Now I don't do that anymore. It's just about taking myself away from the world a little bit, because I can't do my job when I'm hypomanic. It's difficult to coach people with ADHD, or it's difficult to go out and do public talks or training. So it often means that if it's 4 or 5 days of hypomania, after day 2, it's okay, next 3 days not going to work. I'm just going to try and get some sleep and try and eat some food and let it pass. And that was the big acceptance for me with bipolar. And it really helped after 40 odd years of having the symptoms, is knowing it will pass and being able to say to myself, it's okay, you feel low or you're hypomanic, it's going to pass.
And I think you have to have enough episodes to realise it will pass. I mean, yeah, it's true with anything in life, isn't it? It's sort of like the universe will teach you the same lesson until you actually learn from it. And sometimes you just have to sit with that feeling of like, okay, this will pass and I'll learn something from it.
Yeah.
I think every time I go into a dip, I really have to sit and reflect and be like, this is teaching me something. And I've got to really relish the lesson that I'm being taught and try and take that going forward. And actually, Adam Grant talks a lot about this. And he says, from every failure, you learn more and more. And that's why failure is so valuable. Whereas success is success. It's nice. But ultimately, we don't learn nearly as much from our successes as we do from our failures.
No, we don't. I've always said that, particularly if that success is a first-time success. If something just works, then we often don't know why it worked, how it worked, what are the factors that might not have made it work. And embracing failure and accepting, particularly in the context of ADHD, accepting that any coping strategy you put in place, whether it's an app, whether it's a different piece of software, whether it's tackling things at different times of day, it will eventually fail with ADHD. Because once your brain no longer finds it rewarding or novel, it will just say, no, you can't do that. I've had so many different organizational apps that I've used, and then one day I've gone to press the icon on my phone and I just can't. Just literally can't press the icon. My brain's saying that's not rewarding anymore. So learning when that fails that there are alternatives and different ways to do something is a very big part of how I coach and mentor with ADHD, is allowing people to accept, if this doesn't work, that's fine. Because that means we found something that doesn't work and it narrows down the things that can work. So it's really important to see failure as the route to success.
And I think with ADHD, with addiction, with anxiety-related disorders, often they do affect the dopaminergic sort of receptors in the brain. So therefore, you don't get such a dopamine hit as, say, someone without a mental health issue.
Yeah, that's probably the most different part of an ADHD brain in terms of how they are divergent, is the dopamine and reward. So engaging in an activity, taking a substance, being in a place that the brain perceives as pleasurable and rewarding gives us the motivation to engage in that activity again. With ADHD, what we generally tend to see, and I'll ask you a question. If I offered you a slice of cake now or a whole cake in a week's time, which would you pick?
Well, you're talking to someone with an eating disorder, so I'm not sure I choose either.
We can re-record that if you'd want to.
No, it's actually fine. It's actually quite funny. But being me, I delay gratification, definitely.
And that is the exact opposite of most people with ADHD. That delayed gratification is an executive function, a high-level thinking skill. And with ADHD, our brains will almost always direct us towards the most immediate, but often small reward rather than a delayed but much bigger reward. So if you're working on a project for work and it's got to be in a month's time and it's a really big project, you might get a promotion, you might get plaudits, it's a really important thing, but it's a month away. And your phone's in your left hand and there's a game on your phone that just gives you that reward. Your brain will be saying, use the phone, use the phone, use the phone. And don't worry about the report. You can do that next week. You can do that later. So that direction towards small and immediate rewards means we are often engaged with things like, social media and mobile phones and doom scrolling on YouTube, because if it gives the brain reward, it just soothes and calms down a lot of that internal noise.
I'm curious as to when you're in a depressive episode, whether you find that the ADHD actually becomes quieter, because it's almost like your nervous system is so down-regulated that actually the hyperactivity and that constant worryingness actually subsides somewhat, or is that not the case?
No, that is such a brilliant question. And no one's ever asked me that, and I've never really reflected on it. But I think you're right. I think when I'm in a low, partly because I withdraw from pretty much any of the normal, typical activities of daily living. So I won't work when I'm low. I won't see people. I'll just kind of lie on the sofa and watch cartoons, or sit outside chain smoking and kind of talking to myself internally. And I think because I withdraw from the things that ADHD can make challenging, it is less obvious that to myself that my ADHD symptoms are apparent. And whether that's just because I am hyper focusing on the being low and all the internal thoughts, or whether it's because I'm taking myself away from the things that ADHD can be an impairment to, I've not explored yet. But that, I'm going to go away and think about this for the next week, I think, because that's such a brilliant question.
No, I mean, it just struck me as you were talking, and I've often thought about it with my OCD, certainly when I'm feeling like, sometimes sad and depressed, it's whether actually does that elevate my symptoms or does that actually diminish them. And it is interesting, and like you said, I think the brain is very quick to be able to hyper-focus on different things, and so if it's hyper-focused on something that doesn't necessarily work on the dopaminergic system in the same way, it's just an interesting one. I'd like to go back to the second point that I was going to make about the physical symptoms of like potential comorbidities that come with ADHD, because I think that's something that isn't spoken about nearly as much. And I think as someone definitely who has been on SSRIs and who I continue to take something called pregabalin, which is a very, very addictive drug, and I'm really struggling to taper off it completely. And I do sometimes wonder how many of my physical symptoms, I have, hypothyroidism, very Raynaud's, very low bone density. And I know they've been exacerbated by my eating disorder, but there's part of me that can't help but think, is it related to my OCD and also related to the drugs that I've been prescribed? So I'd love you to delve into that a bit more.
Yeah, the physical comorbidities are less well understood. The ones that make more sense involve the brain. So chronic migraines, involve the vasculature, the blood supply around the brain. And it's thought that might be linked to hyperflexible joints through the way in which collagen, which is a supportive protein in the body, forms. And even hypothyroidism, I'm hypothyroid as well, because the signal for thyroid hormone being released starts in the brain. It kind of makes sense that might be the reason that system becomes dysregulated. But then equally, people with ADHD are more likely to be thyroid hormone resistant. So even when I take my thyroxine each day, that might not be working as well because something else is happening. And because the link, I suppose, between the brain and the body is so extensive, it's sometimes difficult without really good research to understand the impact of neurodivergence or the medications that we take on how these coexisting conditions manifest and how disabling they are or how well managed they are.
I know, and it is fascinating, and I think we learn more and more about the human body and the brain and the interconnectedness of just both systems. It's just, oh my God, in 10 years' time, I feel we'll be in a completely different space.
Hopefully.
Well, I hope so too. And I think for those of us who have spent a lot of our adulthood so far really struggling, you sort of think, well, maybe that's what sometimes keeps me going at my darkest moments, is thinking, but like, look at how far. I mean, when I was in my teens, I was never told about the effect that hormones would have on my bone density and the fact that, if I actually didn't have enough estrogen in my system, it would really affect my anxiety levels. Yeah. I mean, even something as basic really now as that. And, given that we now are learning more and more about the human brain, but relatively know so little, it's amazing what's going to happen. But it's finding those tools that work for you.
It is, and it's interesting you mention estrogen because there's evidence that estrogen regulates dopamine release. So when it comes to women's experience with ADHD, it's a lot more challenging because the three M's, menarche, when periods start, menstruation and menopause, and childbirth, we all see either fluctuations or, in the case of menopause, falling off a cliff of estrogen levels. And it's often around perimenopause and menopause when late diagnosed women start to have challenges with brain fog and emotional dysregulation and attention, and then their ADHD symptoms become more apparent. So then you've got this dual challenge of trying to get supported with perimenopause and HRT and trying to get supported with ADHD. And again, it gives you an indication of information that we kind of know that there's hard science behind, but it isn't yet turning into a change in how we practice medicine or provide support, particularly for women.
I know, and not enough women do know about it. I had a conversation with a woman, you describe her exact case. She hit the menopause and she had never been diagnosed with ADHD, and she thought, oh my God, I've got the most awful depression. I don't know what's wrong with me. And a year later, she was diagnosed with ADHD, got put on the right medication, and her life was literally transformed overnight. And there are so many women, I think, who think they're going mad at the menopause. And, you hear those stories, particularly, which were more common, say, 5-10 years ago, that I was aware of, that, women would just say, oh, well, she's gone slightly mad, after she hit the menopause, she just, went a bit batshit crazy. Well, no, it's because maybe she's got a condition that actually has just been exacerbated by the hormonal fluctuations.
And women are more likely to be misdiagnosed when it comes to ADHD with either awfully named, now it's often referred to as emotionally unstable personality disorder, but borderline personality disorder or bipolar, particularly anxiety or depression. And that's partly because if you look at the gatekeepers, GPs, who do an incredible job, they're under-resourced, they're overstretched. For many of them, their training on ADHD would have been 1 or 2 hours at med school 10 or 15 years ago, when they would have been taught ADHD is a disorder of young boys, they grow out of it, and therefore when a woman presents with some of the coexisting conditions of ADHD, it's, I suppose, natural for them to think, well, this looks like anxiety, or this looks like depression, or this looks, it's PMDD, for example, which again, more common in women with ADHD. And therefore those misdiagnoses are costly in terms of the mental and physical health of people that get misdiagnosed. And again, that is most commonly women.
So why are so many more men being diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood?
So the numbers have evened up somewhat from where they used to be. So it used to be that in childhood it was 9 boys to every girl that were diagnosed, and in adulthood 1.5 men to every one when you compare them. Now it's a little bit more even. I think last year was the first year where more women in the UK were referred for assessment than men were, and because of public awareness, that's a good thing. In terms of men getting a diagnosis and having ADHD, there are challenges to men as well. And I find it interesting that with our podcast and our social media, if you look at the podcast demographics, it's 50-50 roughly, men and women. If you look at our social media account, it's 80% women, 20% men. And for many men, there is still that barrier to accepting that there is something wrong, in rabbit ears, with you, particularly for something that's seen as a mental health condition. So for a lot of men, the approach is bury their head in the sand and not engage with a healthcare system that can help them, even though it's a healthcare system that's skewed towards boys and men getting a diagnosis and therefore should be theoretically an easier path.
Well, it's a perceived weakness, and I think generally speaking, women are slightly better at admitting vulnerability and getting help.
100%.
Whereas there's still this sort of macho culture, isn't there? Where
there is. I tell an anecdote when I'm doing public speaking about ADHD and its impact on relationships, and this is a true story, by the way. And I'll say one of the things we are challenged with is mind wandering. And spontaneous mind wandering, particularly when you're having a conversation like this and all of a sudden your brain just shoots off in another direction and you're thinking about other things and then you're back in the room. But if that happens during sex, it's very difficult to maintain an erection when you're thinking about crisps. Now, that's a hard thing to explain to your partner, that I'm sorry that I lost my aroused state in the minute, but I was thinking about prawn cocktail crisps. And therefore, that is something that a lot of men don't talk about. And when I've said this publicly, because I don't have any shame, I think vulnerability is strength. And when I've talked about that publicly, quite often there'll be a man that'll come up after the talk and say, thank you for saying that, because I can't say that to my friends. I can't ever mention anything that's vulnerable, being a man, because there is so much toxic masculinity in our community that men feel that they cannot show that vulnerability, even though that is a route to strength.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Do you think that ADHD is being overdiagnosed? I mean, do you think this? I think again, it's this advent of self-diagnosis, which is slightly detracting from the people who really actually need the help and the resources. And as we said earlier on in our conversation, there are traits of ADHD that everyone displays because it's part of the human condition. However, yeah, what do you think about overdiagnosis?
It's a nuanced argument, and it depends what people mean by overdiagnosis, because there's either too many people are being diagnosed or people that don't have it are getting a diagnosis. If you look worldwide at the statistics, if you get to the point of assessment, and there are many barriers along that way. In the UK, the first step is your GP referring you. And then there'll often be forms you need to fill in or pre-assessments. If you get all the way to assessment, the worldwide statistic is about 93% of people who are assessed are found to have ADHD. And those are pretty robust healthcare systems around the world, which all have kind of the same diagnostic framework or very similar. The issue is that around 4 to 5% of all adults have ADHD, and around 90% of those are undiagnosed. So at the minute, we've gone from a situation where almost nobody was being diagnosed 10 years ago, particularly just before the pandemic as well, to a situation where all of a sudden it's on TikTok, celebrities are announcing they've got ADHD, people are more aware of it, it's in the news, and that's allowing that massive 90% of undiagnosed adults to see, oh, well, that feels a little bit like my experience. So the overdiagnosis argument, I think, is skewed a little bit by the fact that most people, the vast majority of people who are seeking a diagnosis, are in that silent 90%, which in the UK is kind of anywhere between 1 and 2 million adults out there, undiagnosed, living with ADHD, possibly struggling on a day-to-day basis and not knowing why. There are always going to be some people who seek a diagnosis because it feels like ADHD to them. We know that lockdown did increase ADHD-like symptoms in people, but in order to be diagnosed, and this is the key, the symptoms must have been present before the age of 12. It used to be 7, but they've changed the diagnostic criteria, so that normally means you have to have a school report or a parent or sibling to do an informant report. I didn't have either, but I can remember seeing the doctor when I was 8, and the doctor saying, "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown, he's hyperactive, but he'll grow out of it," which was a lie. And that was my recollection of, I was so hyperactive as a child. So for people who don't have that kind of evidence or experience of having the symptoms as a child, and it feels like it's a more recent thing, then it isn't going to be ADHD.
So how do you manage day to day now?
It's like playing Scrabble in a tornado, trying to get things done, basic things done. It is trying to quieten down all of the internal and external distractions, because being distractible, people often think it's, squirrel outside the window or an email notification or a mobile phone notification. But a lot of the distraction's internal. It's thoughts that suddenly pop into your head. It's remembering that you needed to do something that you forgot, or it's racing thoughts or intrusive thoughts just before you go to bed, for example, like getting an earworm that you then just cannot stop. So on a day-to-day basis, it is up and down. And for many people, ADHD is consistent inconsistency. So it can be a good day where you're pretty productive and you get lots done, and then the next day you're not. And learning to accept that is really powerful, because good days are the enemy of bad days. If you have a good day and you're really productive and you get stuff done at work and at home and you see people and you're social and you don't have any of the anxiety or kind of self-directed negative internal talk that day, but then the next day you can't really engage with work, or you're really struggling to, and you don't feel sociable and you've got more anxiety, it can feel like, oh, this is me now, I'm always going to be like this. But the following day you might be back to being productive. So living and managing it day to day really is just about that day. How am I doing today? What can I do to help myself today? Because whilst the long-term behaviours that can help us, like exercise and eating healthy and sleep, are things that I try to work on, the day-to-day stuff, it really is like licking your finger. What's the wind like today? Oh, it's going to be a good day. Fine. I don't really need to do much. If it's a tough day, it's about adapting and working out what's safe for me to do.
Do you think that every adult who's diagnosed with ADHD, sorry, let me repeat that. Do you think that every parent who has a child who's been diagnosed with ADHD should themselves go and get an assessment if they suspect that they might be ADHD?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because it's often at that point, and I hear this so often when I'm doing public talks, it's often at that point when a parent has to fill in those informant reports and they see what the diagnostic symptoms are, that they go, oh, that's familiar. And that's because ADHD is highly genetic. The risk of developing ADHD is about 80% genetic. And we know that from twin studies. So if you take a pair of identical twins, and if they're separated and grow up in different environments, if one has ADHD, the other has an 80% chance of also having ADHD. And any one person with ADHD, their first degree relatives are around 6 times more likely to have ADHD than a random member of the general public. So it does run in families. And it's often when you find out what ADHD is that you can look around your family and go, yeah, dad was. My brother probably is as well. My niece definitely is, for example. And you start to see the behaviours in people that you now know is ADHD. Now, because of that fact, if you grow up in a neurodivergent household where most people in the family are ADHD or autistic, that can just feel like normal. And therefore, for lots of people, if the idea they may have ADHD is introduced, they may say, well, no, but everyone does that, don't they? Because that's how they were brought up, in a neurodivergent, I suppose, affirming household. And in terms of whether a parent should get checked or seek an assessment, obviously it's personal choice, but it is often at that point where family members will start to realise this is something I may have as well.
Mm. For someone who's listening today who's just been diagnosed or suspects that they might have ADHD, what is the very first thing that you'd encourage them to do?
Wow, good question. So learn is one of the most important things. Learn as much as you can about ADHD, and to really try and do that from evidence-based sources, which may not be the most fun. And lots of people with ADHD do, go on TikTok and Instagram, and a lot of the content on there is good. But there are a couple of scientific studies in the last 2 years which have shown that actually a lot's bad. At least 50% of content on ADHD on TikTok is misleading. And there was one study that showed that 92% of the top posts on ADHD either were misleading or false or missed something out. So try and find a source or a resource, whether it's a book or a podcast or a website, that helps you learn about ADHD. And the second thing is, and this is really important, one of the most powerful things anyone with ADHD can do is emotionally accept that you have ADHD, because that gives you that reduced burden, that ability that when something happens, and I still do this, lose your phone for the 20th time a day, and in the past I'd be shouting, oh, you stupid fat idiot, where's your phone, and really chastising myself externally. But when you start to accept that there's a reason these things happen, it's not your fault that this happens. ADHD isn't an excuse, but it's a reason for our behaviours and traits. So getting to that point of acceptance, often through learning about ADHD, is probably the first thing I'd suggest people do.
And where can people find free resources and the help that you offer and advice you offer? Where would you direct them?
I'd start off with the charity website. So we impulsively set up a charity and gave it the wrong name because Alex registered the wrong domain name. It was meant to be called Adult ADHD UK, but it's called ADHD Adult UK, and the website is adhdadult.uk. There's lots of information on there in terms of support with benefits, with assessments, with assistance in the workplace. We also set up an evidence-based online magazine, if you like, called Focus Mag. That's focusmag.uk, where there are short, easy-to-read articles that actually point to the scientific papers that describe different aspects of ADHD. Our podcast, called the ADHD Adults Podcast, is terrible. Don't listen to it, is the best advice I can give to anybody that's listening to this. But there are lots of podcasts out there. There are lots of books out there. obviously I've co-authored ADHD Unpacked, which again is evidence-based, but there are lots of books, and finding something that feels authentic to you is important. So there are lots of resources out there. Just try and find something that speaks to you.
James, thank you so much. What an illuminating, and it's a really interesting episode, which I think will really resonate with so many people. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.